This is an example of the lengths to which these maneuvers went. At the time of the emperor's return from Elba, a letter I wrote my brother was intercepted. In it, I begged him to speak to the Emperor of Russia in the hopes of preserving peace, the one thing I really desired. My handwriting was imitated, and certain remarks were added regarding the best manner in which to approach the Emperor of Russia, whose weak vanity I boasted of being familiar with. This letter, wrapped around a perfume bottle, was taken to the Emperor. If this story is true, as I presume it is on account of a remark made to me by Monsieur Bottiaguina the last time I saw him in Paris, which I did not understand at the time, am I not right in being less severe in my criticism of the Emperor's conduct? After a journey whose fatigues had been increased by the intense cold and the incessant vexations I was exposed to, I arrived at Constance, which is a frontier town belonging to the Grand Duchy of Baden. The sight of its gloomy houses, the deserted aspect of its streets, the quiet which seemed to envelop it, made me consider it a place remote from the world. Such silence after so much agitation, such isolation after having been the center of so many passions pleased me, and I promised myself that there I should find that rest which seemed constantly to flee before me. But a chamberlain of the court of Baden was sent to inform me that the treaties forbade any member of the imperial family to live elsewhere than within the limits of one of the four great powers. Such severity toward a woman to whom he was related, who had proved her friendship for the Grand Duke in the past, at first shocked me. Since then, having found out that he had been obliged to resist the wishes of his entire family, who were anxious to have his marriage annulled, I felt it quite understandable that he should not have desired to provoke new quarrels about someone who was not a close relative. But once more, where was I to go? Everyone was surprised at the courage I displayed in supporting the vicissitudes of fate. I deserved no praise for doing so. Helpless where my heart was concerned, I had received wounds there that would never heal. But the caprices of fortune were beneath my consideration. We became stronger as we became able to watch worldly position and rank vanish without emotion. We feel proud to discover within ourselves the force that makes us consider such things with contempt. Even the hate with which our enemies seek to overwhelm us helps us, by its very intensity, to support their injustice. Passports from the Minister of Russia, which stated in the name of the Allies that I was to be allowed to remain in Constance, reassured my hosts, and I was permitted to stay there, at least provisionally. Thus, I was not obliged again to expose my health, which had been failing rapidly, to all the dangers of a harsh winter. I settled down in a little house on the shores of the lake. But there, too, I was pursued and persecuted in so many ways that I did not know which of the different governments was the most hostile toward me. Naturally, the French envoys did their best to annoy me. They would have been unlikely to allow such an opportunity to escape for proving their devotion to their new master. This was especially true of those who, like Monsieur Auguste de Talleyrand, had in the past served the emperor. I would, however, have expected some personal animosity on the part of Louis XVIII. Instead, he one day said to the Duc d'Otrante Fouché, "People say all sorts of things against her. I do not believe them. Let her go somewhere in Switzerland for a time. Everything will be forgotten and she can come back." I was not inclined to take advantage of this favor, however. I remember too keenly everything I had to suffer in Paris, and I enjoyed, in a sense, being in exile. At least now there could be nothing equivocal about my position. Thus, it was not toward the monarch himself that I felt resentful, but towards those ambitious men who, in order to make themselves seem indispensable, exaggerated the alleged dangers of the situation in which the Bourbons found themselves. The Emperor Napoleon's government never troubled about such minor matters. Once an enemy had been defeated, he was no longer to be feared, and the report of a subordinate could not injure him. The Emperor's genius at once distinguished truth from falsehood. Even had caution made him suspicious, the sense of his power would have reassured him immediately. Then, too, the contempt he had for men in general contributed to make him indulgent toward them. He was rarely mistaken in his general theories regarding human nature, but he offended people by applying these theories to their particular cases. The result was that although those who sought only to further their personal interests were always satisfied, those who felt the need of appreciation in order to be contented were never altogether happy. The amount of work he had to do allowed the emperor only time enough to pay attention to a person's abilities, not to his character. If he made mistakes, it was by trusting those whose interests he had served, rather than whose pride he had flattered. He should have remembered that passions are stronger than deliberate calculation. Thus, when he allied himself completely to Austria through his marriage, he believed in the strength of this union because he felt it was useful to both nations. He did not realize that whereas he could forget his successes, it was harder for his associates not to remember their defeats. His mind was too lofty to understand hatred. He aroused it in others, but did not feel it himself. Even when he was informed that people hated him, he did not seek to punish them. He was therefore prepared to forgive anything except what affected his power or interfered with his plans. One day, I heard him make the following remark: "I have one goal. It is a lofty one, and I wish to attain it. So much the worse for those who get in my way." He illustrated his meaning by comparing his career to a mountain, the ascent of which was difficult, but which he scaled, pushing roughly aside everything that stood in his path. Once he had reached the summit, however, he was prepared to help those whom he had wounded in his ascent. In the retired spot in which I now found myself, I read all the slanders which were being printed about the emperor. Till then, I admit I had never been able to realize how utterly passion can repudiate what is so recently worshipped. As a French woman, it was particularly painful for me to note how my compatriots were lacking in self-respect, since even the captivity of a great man did not disarm their hatred against him. They preferred to sully the memory of his success rather than pity his misfortune. Ingratitude actually became contempt. This crowd of nobility and kings he had created refused to bestow a title on the man without whom they would never have had one themselves. But what harm can such insignificant beings do to a genius? As for us, the members of his family, people displayed their disdain in every way possible in order to please them. We should have abased ourselves, as the Queen of Westphalia, whose behavior was so dignified, expressed it. They are jealous even of the air we breathe. I must do justice to the members of the emperor's family. Under all circumstances, they displayed nobility of sentiment, force of character, and a proper pride. Without money, without anyone to take their side, although exposed to all sorts of vexations, they won people's respect wherever they happened to be. It is true that misfortune makes a man more perfect. If he is inclined to be vain and self-important when fortune smiles on him, it is because prosperity is a bad advisor. It was just after my arrival at Constance that I heard of the execution of Marshal Ney. This showed me that even military glory is not sufficient to avoid people's hatred. In vain his wife had done everything she could to save him. He was bound to die, and all his glorious deeds were not enough to cause his sentence to be suspended. But how was it that even Monsieur Lavalette, so calm, so highly respected by all, and whom only a few could condemn for his unalterable devotion to the emperor, fell a victim to the spirit of revenge on the part of the politicians? When I read how he had escaped, thanks only to his wife's devotion, I trembled for fear he might be recaptured. In that case, it would be useless to count on any sign of the mercy which I had always believed existed. I had been wrong to judge things as they were now, in accordance with what they had been in the past. The fact of being constantly in touch with an exceptional man, and of noticing how his lofty ideals were reflected in his smallest actions, had caused me to believe that I should find these same sentiments everywhere. I forgot that ordinary men all behave alike and are all swayed by commonplace prejudices. To avoid being mistaken in one's opinions of people, one should take care to descend to the level of those whom one is judging. That was why I could not understand what was going on in France. I could not understand the acts of violence that were taking place there. To be sure, I recalled some of those which had occurred in my childhood and from which my family had suffered, but those had generally been committed by unprincipled, uneducated men. Today, under the rule of a respectable family which deserved public sympathy on account of the misfortunes it had suffered, Frenchmen were allowed to assassinate other Frenchmen with impunity. Was it possible to believe that the Bourbons thought themselves foreigners ruling over a foreign land? By doing so, they repudiated the glorious victories our armies had achieved and the benefits of our form of government, even while they were benefiting by them. Instead of trying to prove that the army was insubordinate and the nation corrupt, they should have recognized the value of both and placed themselves at the head of all worthy undertakings. The monarch's recognition of heroic deeds accomplished in the past would have won the support of those whom so many marks of contempt now kept at a distance. Since then, I have grown calmer. I have come to understand that these are the usual effects of a counter-revolution, unless some firm hand directs it, and that the ruler's motto might be the phrase, "Protect me from my friends. I can take care of my enemies." Personally, I found myself surrounded by spies of all kinds. Frequently, in order to win my confidence, they would employ the artifice of pretended misfortune. I would listen to them, even knowing that what I was told might not be true. I went so far as to try to soothe those who, when asking for favors at the same time, protested bitterly against existing conditions. Nevertheless, I remained a highly suspicious character in the eyes of all the governments. Since no actual proof against me existed, my enemies spread all sorts of ridiculous and absurd stories about me. Sometimes it was said I had been seen in disguise in Paris or in some other part of France. Sometimes I was reported to have received officers who had been dismissed from the army or envoys from groups of the emperor's adherents. The more these tales lacked foundation, the more dangerous and skillful I was thought to be. Sometimes I was reminded of that melancholy period when my husband evoked phantoms, which troubled both his peace of mind and my own. I found that governments were inclined to do exactly the same thing. They laid the same snares for me that my husband had, and, as in his case, I made no resistance, but simply continued the even tenor of my ways, trusting in the purity of my intentions and my irreproachable conduct. Now I had, as an added comfort, an idea I had not had before, namely, that it was doubtless part of my destiny to be unjustly suspected, and that I must submit to it, as one does to something that is unavoidable. Among the French exiles I saw arrive at Constance, there were some former members of the Revolutionary Assembly, now almost all grown old and feeble. Piteously banished from Switzerland, they came to spend their days by my side. One poor woman who was suffering from acute lung trouble could not obtain permission to stop at Bern and died an hour after she had completed her journey. On seeing so much misery, weak-minded people might readily have believed that Madame de Krüdener had been really inspired when she had declared, "Those who follow the Emperor Napoleon's cause will be persecuted and tracked down. They will not have a place to lay their heads." I might therefore explain the character of Madame de Krüdener as I deciphered it, and at the same time relate what I afterwards learned about her. After I had listened to her for a little while, it was evident to me that it was her kindness of heart which had attracted her to religion, while it was her too vivid imagination which had troubled her mind. All her inspirations seemed to come to her from God. As she had only pure and beneficent ones, her doctrine was harmless as far as she was concerned. But were not other people in danger of taking promptings of their human desires as instructions of Providence? The ladies in attendance on the Empress of Russia saw Madame de Krüdener frequently at Baden in 1814, and doubtless she predicted the same things to them that she did to me. The Emperor of Russia heard about this, and when he passed through the Grand Duchy of Baden with his troops, he was very anxious to see her. A little superstition is always mixed with our fears and hopes. In times of stress, men feel the need of looking into the future and turn to supernatural forces for assistance. Alexander, pious by nature, was very ready to be led astray in such matters. Not knowing where to find Madame de Krüdener, he was on his knees in prayer, beseeching God to bring her to him, when there was a knock at the door and a letter was brought him from the very person whose advice he considered so supremely important. Such a coincidence was certainly singular. Madame de Krüdener was writing him on behalf of some people who were in distress. The emperor sent for her, and she remained with him until he reached Paris. During his stay there, he went to see her alone every evening. They prayed together, and her influence over him was apparent in his refusal to help in any way those who he considered had incurred the wrath of the Almighty. Thus, out of love of God, he relinquished that of his neighbor, although one must be blind indeed not to see that the two are really the same. She meanwhile went about in the prisons consoling those who were to die, although she was only interested in what became of them after death. She wept with them and encouraged them to pray, but considered it impossible to attempt to save the lives of those whom God had condemned. Among the prisoners she saw was La Bédoyère. Yet the character of Emperor Napoleon did not quite agree with the role her imagination had assigned to him. For a long time she was convinced that he was the Antichrist, whose coming the prophets had predicted, and who would come to reign over the nations of the world, which would bow down before him. As long as Napoleon showed no signs of posing as a divinity, she felt he had not completed his career, and she kept saying, "He will come back." Meanwhile, she labored incessantly to find means to rescue humanity from the being whom she considered capable of causing mankind's damnation. It was she, and no one else, who conceived the idea of the Holy Alliance and caused it to be formed. Madame de Krüdener was wholly absorbed in her mystic visions, and yet politics intervened and used her to accomplish its purpose. Thus, important events may be the outcome of the weakness of a private individual.